Hey there, John.
Hey, Glenn.
How you doing?
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Doing well. This is Glenn Loury of The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv and of Brown University.
And this is John McWhorter of Columbia University. And I want to make a very quick announcement about my appearance now that I'm looking at myself on the camera.
Okay.
Viewers will be able to see my arm, and they're going to see some peculiar kind of scratch marks on it, which may look like I've taken on an unhealthy new habit. That is not what it is. It's that I was working in the garden, and I have a rather intractable rose bush. That is what these scars are.
I got to call you right back.
To let everybody know. So, with that, what are we talking about today, Glenn?
Okay, well, I want to announce, you're announcing about the tracks, I said tracks, didn't I? Scratches on your arm.
Like that.
I want to announce that I've been elected president of the Eastern Economics Association for 2013.
Well,
yeah, man, and that I will be giving the presidential address at that association's annual meetings in your city, New York City, on Friday.
This Friday?
This Friday. And
oh, that's exciting.
Thank you. I'm excited about it. And the topic of my lecture there is going to be what's there to say about affirmative, or what's left to say, I beg your pardon, what's left to say about affirmative action. So that's what I propose that we talk about, since I've been thinking about it a little bit since the Supreme Court is getting ready to hand down an opinion in this important case coming out of Texas. And since you and I have over the years gone back and forth, and you have developed something of a notoriety for your views about affirmative action, John, I'm shocked. Shocked! And I am a former opponent of affirmative action who kind of changed into a defender of affirmative action, who, and you and I have both declared it here at Blogging Heads, have grown weary of talking about affirmative action, and yet I'm going to be talking about it yet again on Friday. So it seems like, you know, even though it is a bit of a passé topic, it's still an important set of questions that we might find something to talk about. So that's what I propose.
You know what I think we have to start with before we even go any further?
Yeah.
Is I think for the viewers we need to clarify something that I'm sure we both agree on, or if we don't, we need to talk about it.
Yeah.
Which is, what do we mean by affirmative action? And the crucial thing there is something that we have to establish. If what we're talking about is everybody's qualifications, depending on what the qualifications are said to be, everybody's qualifications are equal, then it's decided that among those candidates, it's decided that a certain proportion, even if it's rigid, a certain proportion are going to be people of color. So you're going to put a thumb on the scale. I think that's fine. If that's the kind of affirmative action we're talking about, I have never had any problem with that. My problem is when it gets into, let's redefine what qualifications are in order to create diversity. So I just wanted to get that out there. So you have no problem with what I just described, right?
No, I think the distinction that you're making between thumb on the scale and a rethinking of qualifications, or if you will, lowering of qualifications across the board, I assume is what you imply. Because a thumb on the scale does also, in a way, lower, although marginally, the qualifications required of the minimally acceptable minority candidate. I mean, that's what a thumb on the scale would have to mean in practice, isn't it? I mean,
what do you mean?
What I mean is, whereas on the one hand we might say we're appointing professors at the university, why the heck do they need to have published in the top journals? Okay, so that's lowering standards across the board.
Right.
It's attacking the very idea of elitism on behalf of the goal of getting more minorities in.
Right.
Another way of doing it is saying, hey, publications really matter. This African-American candidate doesn't have quite as many as this alternative guy that we might, or woman we might attract, but he has quite enough, and he's African-American. That's close enough for us. Let's go for him. That's the thumb on the scale. And I'm just saying that this latter activity also lowers, although marginally, the required qualification to get the appointment, because otherwise, what would it mean for you to be putting a thumb on the scale?
Well, as long as, in that case that you just talked about, there are some white professors who were given tenure with exactly that many publications as well, and there's a general agreement that there's a point at which superb teaching evaluations or some sort of societal mission or something else
don't override.
matters.
Okay.
So yeah, there's no problem with that. My problem would be with, for example, giving somebody black tenure who really had sharply fewer publications than anybody. But the idea is that because they're black, they should be brought in because they're black, and one wants diversity. And I've seen that, and I think that it creates more problems.
Well, we've all seen it because it's one of the real issues with affirmative action, and so we agree here. I think we just have been putting it in different, slightly different words. A thumb on the scale, but not a foot on the scale, might be one way of putting it.
Oh, that's good. Okay, right. A thumb.
A thumb, not a foot. But it seems to me that there are, and so we agree. And in my mind, I think about that as how much affirmative action, as opposed to whether or not affirmative action. Okay? So the Supreme Court is going to be deciding whether or not affirmative action. I mean, if they strike down if they decide in favor of the plaintiffs in this case coming out of Texas, and if they, in effect, reverse or significantly narrow the grounds that legitimated affirmative action, as was handed down in that opinion that Sandra Day O'Connor is famous for from 10 years ago.
Where she said 25 years ought to be enough. Well,
as part of her commentary, I don't think that was a legally binding. No. It was just an observation that this is not something we expect the government to be affirming forever. But in 25 years is a nice round number. I mean, those are social scientific judgments, I suppose, about what is enough, and 25 years is a round number. And we're coming up on 25 years. That was...
Now they're only 15 more years, right?
A decade has gone by. So, my concern is that the court may say, you can't do any of this because, after all, discrimination is discrimination. This is racial discrimination against white people on behalf of what no longer can be affirmed as compelling, engendering a state of exception in our law that we are prepared to countenance purposes, and that we need to get out of this business. Okay, and that's a very broad ruling, and that would be troubling to me. Now, with respect to the practice of affirmative action, that is this university or that corporation overdoing it because look at what they're doing with respect to qualification or whatever, or how come they have to have such an ambitious goal when the number of qualified people whom they might appoint is so low or something like that. So that's a kind of calibration or a kind of extent, The university doesn't have to shoot for 8% minority. It could be happy with 5% minority. That would be maybe...
And what's to determine?
And that has to be determined by the relative qualifications of the different pools. So, I mean, I'm for being conservative about that and for being mindful of the downside. That is, there are real costs in individual lives and to the quality of the institutional process to overdoing it. So I hope that doesn't sound too wishy-washy, No, it's a matter of degree. I'm saying not a qualitative thing, but a quantitative thing.
And everything is. And if it is outlawed, now I may be missing something here, but if it is outlawed to do affirmative action as we understand it, it seems to me that it can't be prosecutable if an institution can say, the reason that we had 6%, that seems to often be a magic number, 6% of these students being black and Latino is because, yes, we chose them because of their color, but that was after there wouldn't have been any other way to decide. Everybody had these SATs, everybody had these recommendations, everybody wrote an essay of this caliber, and it was a blind process, perhaps. And so once we got to that point, we composed a class. Now, it's not clear to me that would be illegal as opposed to somebody like Abigail Fisher being able to come along and saying, look at these qualifications, mine were higher, why did these people get in? Am I correct in assuming that one could still compose a class after there was no demonstrable way that there were discrepancies among the body of candidates?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. That you could...
What I mean is, could anybody be told, if affirmative action were outlawed as such by this decision coming up, you have broken the law by composing this class where 6% of the students were dark-skinned because you took race into account? Could they be told they were breaking the law if all qualifications were equal, such that there was no way that anybody could say, I should have gotten it?
No, I do not believe. I mean, and even more than that, my understanding is, first of all, I just want to be clear. The answer to your question is no. If there were not demonstrable differences in the qualifications used to determine whether or not students got admitted by race, but if the university nevertheless had an espoused goal of enhancing racial diversity, say through recruitment and outreach or through other things that it might do, and there are a lot of close cases and there's a lot of subjectivity in the process, then I believe that the answer would be no, that would not be outlawed by the court, which is against, which, if it were to rule in this way, would be ruling against racial discrimination against people, which can only be ascertained by pointing to the kind of difference in qualification that you're just talking about. So I don't think that's the case. I want to go further. Texas, as you know, has this other program, which is not being challenged in the Fisher case, of automatically admitting the top 10% of the graduating classes from the state's high schools throughout the state. And that has been undertaken, that policy was implemented in part with the explicit goal of having there be more black and Latino students admitted to the university. So there they have an explicit goal of diversity, which they're pursuing with a policy that, in effect, advantages the black and the Latino applicants. It does it indirectly, but it advantages them nonetheless. And that's not even being challenged in this case. So the court won't, unless it goes outside of the mandate of the case itself, won't need to address that issue at all. So there's still plenty of scope for a certain kind of affirmative action, even if the court rules against.
On top of that, that's right. And what's interesting is that that policy, as perfect as it seemed when it was proposed,
the 10%
is. Yeah, the 10% is resented by a lot of very reasonably minded professors there. I've talked to a couple myself, and you read about it all the time, because they say that it lowers the quality of the student body. But my feeling has always been, if that's true, then that is an indictment of the quality of education for a great many students in Texas, and that it needs to be fixed from the other end. And until then, let's have the quality of that student body be lowered to make that mission more urgent. But then we have the second issue, which is the selective kind of affirmative action that has still gone on. I think partly because of the discovery of that after about 4 years. And Abigail Fisher has complained. And it'll be interesting to see how it comes out. But I think part of the reason we're talking about this is because it seems highly likely that affirmative action of that kind is going to be outlawed. And then where are we?
Well, I want to say a couple of things first. I mean, in that earlier case that was decided 10 years ago or so, where Sandra Day O'Connor handed down the opinion, just to show how long I've been in the affirmative action business, I and some other social scientists submitted a brief precisely on this question of 10% plans and how inefficient they are. Now, this is exactly the point that your fair-minded professors that you were talking about at the University of Texas is making. That was the point that we were making, and it's a broader point that I think deserves to be emphasized here, which is that you can do roughly one of two things. You can do racial affirmative action directly, or you can do something like the 10% plan, which works indirectly. Now, the advantages of going indirect is that you don't have explicit racial discrimination. So there's never an instance where Abigail Fisher's application looks like this, and the black kid who doesn't get in, and the black kid who does get in application looks like that, and the that is much less attractive than the this. That case never arises because everybody was either in or not in the top 10% of their class, regardless of their color, and they get treated with the same preferential deference if they were in the top 10%. So that's the good part of it. Now, the bad part of it is you're letting the tail wag the dog a little bit, because whereas you were only trying to increase the presence of minority students in your student body by some percentage points with your affirmative action policy, by going to a 10% or some other indirect method, you end up changing the admission standard for 100% of the students who are coming to your university. Most of the students admitted to the University of Texas under the 10% plan are not black, and they are not Latino. They are white. Because most of the people in the state, including those in the top 10% of not especially academically strong high schools, are white. So the composition of the student body at the University of Texas has been changed across the board by this policy, which policy was motivated by a desire to increase the presence of blacks and Latinos, who will constitute, a minority, I mean less than 20%, probably less than 15% of the students at the university in any event. So that's the downside of it, you know.
Right, that you get basically young Lyndon Johnsons rather than the young minority students that everybody was expecting. Right. I just got finished reading the latest Robert Caro installment.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to that, but I see what you mean. And when you say it doesn't sound like it's necessarily a bad outcome.
Glenn, you just cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you hearing me now?
Yeah, now.
Okay. I said the way you put it. It doesn't sound like necessarily a bad outcome to get some young Lyndon Johnsons into the University of Texas than to get, you know, which is the argument, than to get the doctor's son or something who is African American but who was a marginal applicant.
Right.
So that raises the class versus race issue and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So since we're talking about it, let me opine on that just briefly, which is I think long-term class has got to be where we're focused. Mm-hmm. In terms of equality of opportunity in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Short term, we still have a problem of the underrepresentation of African Americans in the elite cadres that we're training at these universities. We still have it 50 years after the height of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And it's a problem worth addressing. It is not the central thing. It's not poverty. It's not hunger. It's not homelessness. It's not mass incarceration. Okay, it's not people not having health care. Those are major frontline issues that are of universal moral significance that a decent society should address itself to. But this lingering underrepresentation, marginalization, if you want, I don't mean to impute motives to anybody, but just saying that people are on the margins, of African Americans in the elite governing, ruling, corporate managing, political elites, academic elites, and so forth. Underrepresentation is a problem that I think that we should address. So I simply don't want us to give up on that by declaring we've elected Barack Obama, we got to the 21st century, all that was a long time ago, we're done, because I don't think we're done.
Here's where we have hit our roadblock. I think we are done with exactly what you just said. I think that affirmative action should be about opportunity. I think that an argument that affirmative action is based on your socioeconomic class and whether or not you have had the opportunity to be prepared in the way that the elite cadre of students of whatever their race have been prepared is an argument that few people would raise anything against, and those who would say, no, there should be no adjustment of affirmative action, there should be no adjustment of admissions policies, even slightly, for class or socioeconomics, those people are never going to have a strong voice in society, certainly not among the people who run admissions. Now, in terms of attending to something very real, which is creating the Barack Obamas and the Eric Holders and the Michelle Obamas, that is something that I think was very important starting in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And I think where we might differ is that I say, we did it. We didn't only do it for 5 years or 10 years or 20. We did that for 2 generations. It helped, and I think everybody should know, I know very well, that directly created me. I know. I'm thankful. I get it. I was there. I knew about it while it was happening. But the question is whether you do it forever. And I think that for various reasons, and you and I are very aware of them, you don't do it forever. It's like applying chemotherapy. You have to do it very carefully. And one reason that it has to be like chemotherapy is because there comes a point where after the boosts have been given, after the rules have been broken, and they needed to be, in order to really get to the end of it, it has to be that this elite cadre of black students and black parents who are raising them have no choice but to do what everybody else does and exactly what everybody else does, including submitting to the luck of the draw to an extent, in order to have the necessary tools. And I think that it's time that became where we got to the rest of the way to the mountaintop. And that, I think, is why I'm sometimes known as very conservative on affirmative action. I'm not conservative on it. I just think that it should now be about class, even though that's going to mean more Lyndon Johnsons than Theo Huxtables from the college.
Hold on. So let me ask you a question, John. And I'm not being argumentative. It's a serious issue.
Sure.
So would you say the same thing about women? So there exists affirmative action for women in a variety of different venues. I can pick up the newspaper and see articles about how many women are there in President Obama's cabinet. Mitt Romney can say binders full of women, and that can be, a gaffe in a presidential campaign. There is affirmative action for women. At my university, in my department, which is the economics department, there has been concern expressed over the years about the lack of women. Would anyone, in response to a discussion, and it may be a good idea, maybe a bad idea, maybe necessary in some venues, not in others, whatever, would anybody, in the context of talking about affirmative action for women, say, we need class, not gender? We should have affirmative action. No, they wouldn't. I answer my own question. They would understand that gender diversity in the halls of power is a good in and of itself, not substituted for by class diversity, perhaps complemented by class diversity, but it would be a good in and of itself. No one would say, I don't think, that the women whom we're appointing tenured professor of economics because they're qualified to be tenured professor, even if not as qualified as the one that we didn't appoint who was a man, of that person, do you know that her father was a doctor and now she's getting affirmative action? Right. So my question to you, John, is why? Why is it that when we talk about racial diversity and the use of affirmative action to diversify elite cadres by race, people reach for the class argument and say, that's the value that we should be affirming. And by doing so, indirectly say, racial diversity in and of itself is not a value worth affirming. I didn't say that you said that, but I say that that's an indirect implication of the argument that you made. Whereas with respect to gender diversity, it never even occurs to anybody to imagine that having a working class person sitting in the seat instead of a woman would somehow get the same job done. That's my question.
That's a very good question. And of course, it depends on its framing as, for example, the idea of what is affirmative action good for. And I maintain that I have a very spare view of it. What affirmative action is good for me, and we can talk about the notion of what good diversity is, but that was kind of an ex post facto argument that started largely after 1978 and the Bakke case. For me, affirmative action is about addressing inequality. And you know what, Glenn, and I truly believe this. I believe that the obstacles towards, for example, women becoming tenured faculty today are more concrete and more societally ingrained than the obstacles for middle class. Note I said middle class.
I know what you said, but I still got my eyebrows raised over here, John.
And what I mean is, and this is part of the national conversation now, and I think it's undeniable, is that our society...
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, Glenn, let me finish.
Yeah.
Our society's structures are such that women are unfairly penalized when it comes to particularly responsibility for child rearing, and it has all sorts of implications for what women's career paths end up being. And we as a society need to address that. The situation for middle-class black kids and why they don't submit the top-rate dossiers to a Princeton as often as their white equivalents do are very different. And I don't think they lend themselves as gracefully to set-aside mentality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think I agree with much of it. They certainly are different. They're very different. And they are evidently not so easily reversed by the kinds of policies that are readily at hand, like preferential affirmative action by race. I agree with that. And I even agree, John, with the generic claim that at some level or in some sense, the barriers to women's success in many of the competitive venues that affirmative action is practiced in are more subtle and in some ways more deeply entrenched than are the barriers in the 21st century to the penetration of these enclaves by African Americans of a certain class, education, cultural orientation, so forth. I think I agree with that. Well, the reason I want to interrupt you was I was going to say that was a thought in my mind in 2007, 2008, when Hillary Rodham Clinton and Barack Hussein Obama were competing for the nomination of the Democratic Party, and one of them was going to be elected president. And my thought was, I don't know where you were at the time, John, I somehow recall that you and I had different views about those candidates, was that the breakthrough of Hillary Rodham Clinton becoming the commander-in-chief for the long-term, equality interest of the society would have been much more profound than the breakthrough of Barack Hussein Obama becoming the first, quote, black president, close quote. Of course, everybody knows I got a burr in my bonnet about Barack Hussein Obama because he's not black enough for me, and blah, 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 blah. But having confessed that, I still want to associate myself with your sentiment, which is that the gender barrier is at the top, at the very top of many of these institutions, is subtle and it's very deep. And being black, just having dark brown skin, is not anything like the impediment to getting accepted and being respected and not being suspected and not having to perform out, all these different things that you have to deal with in order to be able to succeed in that venue in the same way that women have that barrier. I do agree with that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But I still think that if the National Bureau for Economic Research, I just give one example, is going to have a program doing quantitative research on crime and punishment in America, as they do. And they're going to get large funds from the National Science Foundation and private foundations and others, as they do, in order to support it. And they're going to have PhD programs training criminologists and sociologists and quantitative sociologists, social psychologists, and economists in the study of crime and punishment in America in the 21st century, with 2.5 million people under lock and key, of whom half are black. Some of those scholars need to be black. And I'm sorry, just let me finish. And if we don't do anything proactive, too few of them will be. I still think that that's true.
What's too few?
Too few is when I went out to Berkeley 3 years ago to the NBER conference out there and gave a talk on this subject, and I looked at a room with 200 people. I saw 2 black faces in it. Yeah. That's too few. Now, if you want me to give a number, I'll give one, 5%. Of course, I don't mean that, I don't mean anything by it in particular, but I know that 2 out of 200 is too few.
No.
So let's argue that.
I don't see it. Can I still hear you going?
I don't know. I can still hear you.
Okay. No, because frankly, it's not 1965. And let's say that there aren't as many black people in that room as you'd like. Almost every white person in that room is on fire with a commitment to addressing a situation that disproportionately affects black people, such that I don't feel like that criminology is in bad hands, and I would rather every black person in that room be the exact same pointy-headed, intimidating number cruncher, such as yourself and Roland Fryer are, than that any standards have been changed out of a sense that racial loyalty will matter in a key way. Let's say you have some people in there where different considerations were made. Not important enough in the long run. I think that the black race will be just fine with those particular people in that room who had those concerns. Most of them are thinking about black people in prison, not white ones. Aren't they? I mean, I wasn't there, but I'm just...
Well, if we're talking about their ideological colorations, they're more progressives than not. I would reckon they're academics after all. If you're talking about whether or not having black skin makes your criminology better criminology for black people, no, I don't believe anything silly like that. Okay. But I do think, I don't know if you've seen this nice book by, he's an economist as it happens, a political scientist. His name is Scott Page, and he's at the University of Michigan. And the book is called The Difference. And then there's a subtitle. He's a quantitative social scientist, and some parts of the book are a little bit technical, but mostly it's written for a popular audience. And it basically says creative teams that have diverse compositions think differently than creative teams that have relatively more homogeneous compositions. And without treading, I think, at all into the swamp of racial essentialism. Oh, black people think like this and white people think like that. No. No one believes that. I think the character of the conversations that people have, and by conversations, I don't just mean around the water cooler. I mean when they strategize about a research project, when they think about the kind of questions that they want to ask within the context of their research, when they weigh various kinds of evidence and testimony in assessing, when they compose the narrative, where they take their various expert findings and weave them into a structure of reportage, I might say, that then tells a story about where the country is, where it's been going, and so forth, that black voices matter. I do think there is such a thing as black voices. I think growing up on the south side of Chicago, everybody comes from someplace, okay, and coming from a place.
Yeah.
And so I mean, around the margins, okay, not at the center of the
Yeah.
undertaking. I don't think it's a disaster if it stays 2 out of 200 black people in that room for the practice of criminology. I just would rather some of my African American graduate students be able to see some of these role models and so forth and so on. I know that's so 70s, John. It's so 70s.
It is. Yeah. And, you know, I think it was good for the 70s. And I don't mean because the 70s was in the past. The question is how long that goes on. And I know what you mean about the black voices. There's something to it. But it's just a matter of priorities. And some of this is visceral. I think it's funny. My students in my contemporary civilization class that just finished found me online. Randall Kennedy. Of all people, I think this is a criticism from him. I thought he and I were okay, but in his latest book, in passing, he calls me a racial loyalist for my having supported Obama. He thinks that the only reason was that he was black, and I'll admit that there's some of that. You're being a racial loyalist to an extent here, and I guess if that's visceral to an extent, if I may, I have a little bit of that too. And my feeling about these notions of the black voices in the room, I'm just too deeply imprinted by in my own field, having witnessed too often a thoroughly black person up there at the podium being black, and, you know, everybody, all the white people in the room think that's so wonderful, and they're congratulating themselves quietly on the fact that they're listening to this person who's up there being black and accepting that person being black, and they aren't thinking as much about the rigor of that person's arguments because they think that this blackness is so beautiful. And that was a price that we had to pay in the 70s and the 80s. You give it a generation, and we gave it two. And as far as I'm concerned, it's now time to just knock that off. We did that long enough.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, John, I do know what you mean, and I agree with that. I agree that trotting out people who are obviously not competent or marginally competent, and then suppressing our critical judgment of their lack of competence out of some kind of politically correct deference to their blackness, and then thinking that they add value simply by being black and being in the room, and so we're prepared to hold our noses at them not being competent, is one, no way to run a railroad, so it's bad for the organization that's doing it, and no way to build your reputation as a people worthy of honor and dignity. So it's bad for African Americans too. So I definitely agree with that, and that's not what I'm talking about.
You sure?
Well,
because you want there to be more black people in that room you're talking about.
Yeah.
But how do you get them in there?
Okay, so some of what you are afraid of will happen under any practical scheme to do what I want to do. Mm-hmm. It will be, if you like, collateral damage,
right.
or part of the cost of doing the other thing. And because there is this danger, and let me just be explicit, the danger is compromising a judgment about standards specifically with respect to African Americans in order to entertain some desire to diversify your elite cadres. Okay, some of that is bound to happen through any practical scheme. But it's not the only thing that will happen. Some of the other things that will happen will be that people who might not have gotten selected because they weren't, frankly, the best of the candidates will get a chance to show that they are more than adequately competent. And some of them are going to end up being brilliant and extraordinary people. But that's not the forecast for most of them. But most of them are not going to be klutzes who embarrass you by getting up there and doing a kind of... something in blackface or something like that. Most of them are going to end up getting PhDs in criminology and going to work at a university or in a government agency someplace and being a black presence where otherwise they might not have been. And I still think that's worth doing.
You know, I should specify, Glenn, that I'm not necessarily talking about the black person up there in the room who's clearly underqualified and everybody's just going crazy. That really is something that was more happening when I was a child.
Yeah.
That's like a scene out of 1972.
Right.
I really mean something more nuanced, where somebody up there, they're not incompetent, they're fine, but really there's a whole lot more that could be said against their reasoning, whether it's about race or not, that isn't said because everybody just thinks they're so wonderful because they're black. And, maybe that they're black and they speak well. There's some of that. The idea is that, well, there you go. A lot of the judgments of people like that among the white people I'm talking about are quite unconscious. Nobody's thinking.
I understand.
But it's there, and it just it's a problem because I feel that we need to. Here's what I think we should be working towards. So let's see. Do we both agree with this? Neil deGrasse Tyson the black astrophysicist.
Yeah, we agree with
I
this.
have to say, Neil Tyson, and I've met him several times actually, and it's clear that one thing is that he is black, and he knows it, and he wrote an autobiography a little early, if you ask me, where he writes about racism.
It's all about the dollar, my man.
I know. I probably shouldn't say that, but
you better strike while the iron is hot. I mean,
And he did this years and years ago, but he wrote about his experiences of being black and racism. So it's not that he doesn't understand these things, but when you see him on TV or when you meet him, he is clearly an astrophysicist just like the others. No astrophysicists are listening to him and thinking, well, he's black and aren't we special for accepting his ideas. Now, we can't have all black scholars be exactly like that yet, but we're supposed to be working towards it after these 40 years.
Of course we are, and let me agree with you, man. I mean, brother Neil deGrasse Tyson knows what he's talking about, and I feel pride every time I see him, holding forth brilliantly and entertainingly and whatnot, whether it's on the Daily Show or PBS or whatever it is. So absolutely, and let me say further, as you know, my son Nehemiah Matthew Loury is about to graduate from Columbia University with a bachelor's degree in astrophysics. Okay, and young Nehemiah has a very high GPA, and he's just been blasting away in quantum mechanics and other kind of physics stuff, and in astronomy courses, and in mathematics, and he's doing this thing. Okay, and he got a job offer from a big Silicon Valley firm, and maybe going out to San Francisco. Good. And I'm never going to see him again. Oh my God! But anyway. I'm so proud of him I could just burst, okay? And part of the reason I'm proud of him is not because he's got a Columbia degree, because he's got a job at, a leading software engineering concern. I'm proud of him because he's showing that black people can be math wizards sitting in the front of the room with their, knowing all their Fourier transforms and their, whatnot, just the way anybody else can. And he's not looking for anybody to. Give him a thumb on the scale.
Right.
I'm really very proud of him. But look, he had 2 PhD parents. He is an extraordinarily advantaged kid in many respects, and he's got his natural talents, and he's worked hard, and he's delivering. Okay, some young people who are of African American background, and some who are not of African American background, I grant you, have the talent that he has, but haven't had anything like the opportunity that he has. There are just not enough kids like him, and I want to, expand the number. But anyway, I'm doing 2 things. I'm covering ground I've already covered, and I'm losing conviction in my own argument the longer I talk.
Glenn, I think of it this way: you have that experience with Nehemiah, and I have my little daughter. And I first said this before she existed, but now she does exist. And, she's half white and half black, but in the eyes of many, that makes her black. Okay. I imagine when she hits a certain age, she's going to be told by some people that she better understand that she's African American. I don't know how she will respond to that. Maybe she'll decide that is exactly what she is, and that's fine with me. But she is this brown-skinned girl. And Lord forbid, when she applied to any kind of school or college, that given the advantages that I and my wife are going to give her, and she's going to be a faculty brat, that anybody think, oh, we're going to take her over, some white kids who actually their SATs were higher than hers and they had more this and that than her, because she's this pretty little brown person, and she's going to be diverse, and she's going to lend her insights to the students on campus who are taking French and playing the tuba. I don't want it.
I hear you. I hear you. And I wasn't saying, of course, I think everyone understands that my son's achievement somehow owed anything to affirmative action. And, to the extent that he would have been given a break because of his skin color, I would have felt similarly to you.
Okay, yeah.
Similarly to you, which is to say, come on, man, this kid has had every advantage. I mean, let him rise or fall on his own merit. I mean,
exactly.
Come on, give him a chance to be who he is. Don't patronize him. Would have been what I would have said. So we agree about that.
So affirmative action should go not to Nehemiah or to Dahlia, but to a different black kid who hasn't had those sorts of advantages. In other words, black people of a certain class. just like white people
Well,
in a certain class.
Okay. So
That's all I think.
well, except that the class thing interacts with the race thing such that by the time, if you wanted to put a class constraint on it, you want to say parents that didn't get a college degree plus being black. The number of really qualified candidates for a place like Brown or Princeton or Columbia is going to be so low that you're not going to be able to find them. There's something called the racial achievement gap out here. Last time I looked, public education wasn't serving the lower class African American communities very well, and so forth and so on. There will be some, but there won't be very many. Not enough to go around if I take all the Ivies and all the Big Tens and all the Pac-10s and all that. So, if you wanted, now I'm talking about college, to have diverse student bodies, and I do think that that's a value, a pedagogic value. I don't need 10%, but I need some.
Sure.
Then if I did the race intersect class number on it and excluded the Dahlias and the Nehemiahs from even being considered for affirmative action, I wouldn't have, it's a dilemma. I wouldn't have enough kids to go around is what I'm saying. So it's a dilemma.
That's interesting. And the question is, and this is a tough one. The argument, Yale or jail, is the way somebody used to put it.
Jesse Jackson.
We often talk as if there are only 10 schools.
Yeah.
Why is it so terrible
Yeah.
if there are only a few at the Columbias and the Yales, but there are vastly more one step down at thoroughly excellent universities such as the University of California at San Diego or Rice, etc.? And many people say, well, it's the connections you make. Is that really?
No, I wouldn't make that argument at all. It's not terrible for African Americans. And in fact, it might even be better for African Americans. This is the mismatch hypothesis. Richard Sanders and others have put forward this idea that
law schools, but
but it's also out there in colleges too. There are people who are arguing that blacks won't major in sciences as much because they end up at universities where the science curriculum is very demanding, and so they go off into the softer disciplines. But if you had let them go to a less demanding university, they might have been able to complete a curriculum in science just fine there. There are people who make that argument too. But I want to say there would be nothing wrong with them not being at Yale or Princeton and being at Rice or UMass Amherst, for that matter. Nothing wrong with that for black people, but there would be something wrong for Yale and Princeton. They wouldn't have the adequate for their pedagogic purposes representation of the minority students in their student body. If they did that, they'd go from 6%, I just make the number up, but it's roughly accurate, to 2%. And that would be noticed, and it would be harmful to them in terms of what they're trying to do at their universities, even though black people would survive that just fine.
And what would the harm be? Because frankly,
it would be a lot of classrooms without any black faces in it, and kids getting educated in elite studies who didn't have the benefit of interacting with African Americans and hearing from African Americans in their classroom.
Right, we're going into very theoretical territory.
And we're going to have to end, by the way, John. I've got somebody waiting outside my office door now, so please go ahead, but I need to get...
I'm going to be very quick.
Okay.
One, how many classes actually concern the sorts of things where a person of color's opinions would be of value? And two, and we should just continue this, two, if we're talking about how to interact with dark-skinned students, it's tough to say what that would mean, but if we're talking about the Nehemiahs and the Dahlias, how different is the interaction anyway? What do we really mean by interacting with black people? I think those are things that need to be talked about that aren't spelled out often enough.
Let's have another conversation, John. Let me just say this. I wanted you to have the last word, but I got to tell you this. So 3 or 4 years ago, I'm teaching an undergraduate class on race and inequality in the United States, and I've got an African-American student in there, and we get to talking in the classroom about affirmative action, and there's a debate going on between some conservative white students and some well-heeled liberal African-American students doing what you would expect them to do. And then this kid who went to public schools in Washington, D.C., and who from his dress and his body language, sitting in the back of the class almost by himself, you could tell was uncomfortable at Brown, who's black, pipes up and
I know that kid.
Pipes up and says, these black kids that I'm supposed to be, all buddies with, whatnot, and you got so much diversity. I haven't seen them since freshman orientation, where here at Brown we have a special thing for third world orientation. They're off skiing with their prep school buddies. This kid says that in the class.
Yep.
Okay? So there you are. Okay?
Let's use that as just kind of the suspense and do part 2.
Okay, we'll do part 2, John.
There's clearly more to be said
Indeed.
on this.
Thanks so much, and we'll talk.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.